Yu-Gi-Oh! Master Duel can be quite an intimidating game to new players, especially ones that are new to Yu-Gi-Oh! As a franchise. So the best way for newer players often to get involved in Yu-Gi-Oh! Directly is through the building of structure decks. Now, at this point, after the release of the latest Blackwing structure deck, we now have 11 different decks to choose from, each of which costing 500 gems, which makes them all very affordable and easily accessible to any new player. So in this video, we're going to be talking about which structure decks are actually worth investing into, not only for their ease of learning, you're also going to be evaluating their overall power compared to one another, not compared to anything else, just compared to one another, the amount of value they present you in terms of long-standing cards that you're going to be used later, as well as educational purposes. What does the deck teach you? Is it intuitive? Is it easy to learn? What skills are you going to take out of that you can then bring to other decks in the future of Master Duel? And we're going to start off with one of the earliest decks of Master Duel, and that would be Dragon Maids. Now, Dragon Maids is unironically still really good in terms of its overall value, versatility, and sort of budget friendliness. So, deck presents itself with a bunch of different powerful boss monsters, most notably among them Dragon Maid Shio, as well as Hieratic Seal of the Heavenly Spheres. Now, these are cards that are not only high valued with the amount of different URs that you get. Cards like this will be reusable in Dragon Link decks down the line, as well as your Xiao, and more importantly, cards like the Red Eyes Darkness Metal Dragon are all very powerful cards that you will be reusing later down the line. Now, if you were to pick up 3 copies of this structure deck, you will be able to build a very versatile deck. It has a bunch of different removal options, it has some revival and protection, it has negates, it has bounces, it has lots of searching going on. So this deck is a really good way to jumpstart your Master Duel career, if you will, and teach you many of the most basic mechanics around graveyard usage, around searching your deck, around consistency, as well as throwing in a little bit of combo potential without being overwhelming. So this is going to be the perfect starting place for the vast majority of players, and for that reason, we're going to start off with a very strong A tier. I think we might adjust this as we're going along, but Dragon Maid really is still just as good as it always has been. It hasn't really been hurt or anything as the game has progressed, so Dragon Maid is as solid as it's been. Getting into the next one, we have the Utopia structure deck. Now, that's going to be a little bit of a different situation. The Utopia structure deck, while not terrible, is definitely not in nearly as good a position as Dragon Maid's. It does teach you about combo potential and utilizing Exceed monsters to the fullest sort of extent. There's lots of combo cards in here, and if you were to purchase 3 copies of this structure deck, there's actually more than enough good cards that typically don't see play to fill out the deck with decent cards. You have your Zexal Construction, you have your Astraltopia, your Zexal Souls, as well as some cards that you maybe don't see in meta-based Utopia strategies, such as Zexal Entrust, which is actually quite a decent card. So there's definitely a lot of cards in here that you can bulk out and make quite a solid Utopia deck out of, but the Utopia cards in general don't have very much of a place or a win condition outside of their big boss monster being the Ultimate Leo Utopia Ray. But this guy is pretty damn fierce. So if you're a fan of the Zexal anime, or in general if you want to go in a slightly different path than Dragon Maids, this is definitely not a bad one to pick up. You will be able to net yourself some wins, but a lot of the cards in here aren't very splashable into other strategies, so anything you pick up as part of this deck will basically be self-contained within this deck. You'll not be able to bring it to anything else for the most part anyways. So for that reason, again, very capable deck, especially compared to some of the other structure decks, but because of its lack of splashability and because some of the cards are overly specific, we're going to bring it down just to a B tier here. I think that's a very solid place for it. B tier I would look at saying, like, it definitely has a win condition, it has an identity, it knows where it wants to go, and it can win games, but maybe it doesn't present you with the best of value. Next, we're going to be talking about Spellbook of Prophecy. Now, this one's a little bit different. There's a lot of very good cards in here, some of which are even splashable, such as your Spellbook Magician of Prophecy himself and a couple of your Spellbook cards. Outside of that, though, most of these cards aren't going to see play outside of this deck. The one thing that this deck sort of struggles with is having a clearly defined win condition. Now, it may be difficult for newer players in particular to envision a path to victory using this deck, since you're not reliant upon any one particular boss monster to net you a bunch of value. You're not reliant upon really powerful cards. The deck is more so built around grinding and recycling, which isn't always the easiest thing for new players in particular. There's definitely some decent value to be had here, but the lack of a win condition and the lack of relevance as well as splashability for a lot of the cards does hurt its viability compared to other structure decks. So for now, we are going to be putting this down as a C contender. Possibly even lower. I could see it going lower because some of the other decks, it's among the very few that don't have that sort of glorified, straightforward win condition, right? And that's very important when it comes to a new player getting involved in the game, because they don't know all of these rulings, they don't know how valuable certain cards are, you don't need to know what to banish, what to negate, what to stop, which means you're gonna struggle picking this deck up as a new player and just bringing it straight into ranked. Definitely not terrible, but there are for sure better options. Next up is the famed Gaia deck. So this one is, I'll be honest, when this deck came out, I kind of railed on it a little bit. It's not that bad compared to the other structure decks, to be honest with you. I think it is better than the Spellbook of Prophecy deck. It has a few really, really good cards. The Blackluster Soldier Envoy of the Beginning is a phenomenal card, as is the Soldier of Chaos, and the Gaia the Magical Knight of Dragons is also a pretty solid card. The deck does have a little bit of an identity crisis. There's a lot of mechanics mixed into one. You've got Ritual, you've got Link, Fusion, and it doesn't really know what direction to take itself in, as well as being mixed with a bunch of not very good cards. So while the deck does have an identity and does have a win condition, and there are certain splashable cards, it is definitely having an identity crisis. It's trying to do too many different things. A lot of the cards are too overly specific to one side of the deck or the other to find utility in basically every hand. What you would need to do with this deck is you would need to purchase 3 copies of it and basically choose a lane to go down. Are you going to build a Blackluster Soldier deck, or are you going to build a Gaia deck? Both of which are totally fine, if not both of them being underwhelming, but the fact that this deck basically when it launched didn't bring any new cards with it, that's not going to matter to a new player, so one of my biggest criticisms aren't applicable. In terms of its viability, I would find this deck somewhere between C and B. I'm going to keep it C for now, but we may bump it up later on because it does genuinely have some win conditions. The Blackluster Soldier in particular, the Envoy of the Beginning, is a very, very powerful card, as is Gaia, the Magical Knight of Dragons. So it definitely does have win conditions and it does have an identity. It probably is going to be bumped up to B, to be honest. I would see it somewhat on par with the Utopia deck. So we're going to leave it in B next to Utopia. I think that that's a very solid place for it. I think the value that you get out of it, if nothing else, would at the very least bring it up to Utopia, even if Utopia has a more defined and more viable win condition. Now, if you want to talk value and if you want to talk nostalgia, the next deck is going to be the one for you, the Vortex of Magic, that being a Dark Magician based strategy. This deck, this structure deck, holds a ton of value for anyone who's a fan of the original anime. Almost every player of Master Duel at some point wants to find themselves playing Dark Magician, and you get so many UR cards in this, and a lot of them are really goddamn powerful. Magician Souls, Illusion of Chaos, you've got Soul Servant, you've got Circle. Basically everything you need to build Dark Magicians is inside this deck, even the fusion monsters. So they really did well with this deck. I'm going to be perfectly honest, there's not really anything they could have included that I feel like they missed. I feel like everything you would need to build Dark Magician is right here, and for that reason, it has a very clear cut win condition, it's not overly complicated, and it is actually somewhat decent. The Eternal Soul Dark Magical Circle loop, and being able to constantly revive your Dark Magician every single turn, your Eternal Soul making your Dark Magician completely unaffected by card effects, and anytime you summon him, you get to banish a card. So you've got really big 2500 beater that's banishing one of your opponent's cards every single turn while being protected, having incredible consistency in the form of Magician Souls, Dark Magical Circle, Magician's Rod, all of these cards that search and draw and mill and grab and revive. Your consistency is incredible because, again, you need to bear in mind, we're only talking about the structure decks here and the contents within. A lot of the other decks don't have nearly as many consistency cards built into their actual structure deck. So Dark Magician, definitely one of the better ones if you're just looking to get into it. I think that this is definitely a solid A. I would say even better than Dragon Maids, for sure. In terms of, especially when it comes to just splashable value, if you're ever at all interested in building Dark Magician, and if you're a fan of the show, if you're a fan of the anime, you're going to want to play Dark Magician at some point. I can guarantee you the value that you're getting out of this deck you will not regret. Staying true to our theme of magicians, we've got the Magician of Pendulum structure deck up next. The Magician of Pendulum structure deck is definitely one of the more confusing ones. It definitely has some really solid cards in the form of Sky Iris and Spiral Flame Strike, being able to grab you a bunch of cards. The Performapal Pendulum Sorcerer is one of those cards that if you ever do decide to go into Pendulum Magicians will be very viable. So there's definitely a little bit of value to be had in this deck, but again, it's one of those decks that just has a complete identity crisis. It doesn't know what its win condition is. It doesn't really have a clear-cut path to victory. The fusion monsters are very obtuse when it comes to their summoning requirements. The other monsters don't really do much of anything, if I'm honest, as well as being rather tough to summon. So I feel like the deck definitely suffers from a bit of an identity crisis, and it's definitely not beginner friendly in terms of the learning curve. Trying to learn pendulums while also learning synchros, while also learning fusions, while also learning exceed, it's a lot for a new player to take in, and I would see a new player getting very overwhelmed with this deck very, very quickly. So again, given its lack of win condition, given its lack of versatility, a lot of these cards are never going to see play outside of Pendulum Magician decks, which are very expensive to build as is, so a new player is not going to have immediate access to all of the cards that make a deck like this good. For that reason, unfortunately, we are going to have to rank it quite low. I feel like a C tier is being generous to this deck. Very few of the cards you get here are actually conducive to your own strategy winning. I would be very tempted to put this in the D tier. In fact, I'm going to. And the Pendulum Magicians, just in terms of its context of being beginner friendly, it's just not good for new players. You're going to fry your brain if you've never played Yu-Gi-Oh before and you try picking this one up. If this is your first deck ever trying to play Yu-Gi-Oh, it will fry your brain. Most experienced players don't even take the time it needs to master Pendulum Summoning, even when they're going against it every single day. So yeah, don't worry about that. Pick up something else, pick up something that's a little bit easier for you to learn, and once you understand the rest of the mechanics in the game, once you understand Link Summoning, once you understand Synchro Summoning, you can come back to this when you got a couple gems in your pocket and you can build the full version. This diet version, this budget version is not going to be it, Chief. It's just not cut it. It's not going to cut it. It just isn't. Next up, we've got a personal favorite of mine. We're going to be talking about Immortal Glory, the zombie structure deck. The zombie structure deck definitely has a ton of really good cards in it that you can splash into a number of different decks. Zombie World is phenomenal. It's actually probably one of the best cards available in any of the structure decks cumulatively. Zombie World is a phenomenal card, as well as having really good value in the form of Unizombies. Some of your synchro monsters as well are pretty damn cool. It comes with, of course, Nekoro Banshee, Gozuki, Mizuki, all of these cards that are integral to the building of even meta-relevant zombie strategies. So definitely really good. This deck has in it everything it needs to do its job, barring one card. If they had have included Doom King Ballardrock in this deck, this would be a contender for the best structure deck. Missing the Ballardrock, it is missing that edge. It really is. The actual win condition of the deck becomes significantly slower, and you're now relying upon sort of zombie beatdown, if you will, unless you want to set up a Felgrand loop, which most experienced players don't even know how to do because it's not that easy, and to be honest, it's not that good. So while there are amazing control options for the deck, and your alternative win condition then, because you're not playing Ballardrock, how you're going to win with this deck instead is playing slow, playing control. You're going to play a lot of your spells and traps to slow down your opponent. You're going to try and swing for as much damage as you possibly can and just grind them down over time. Rely upon how spammable your monsters are to constantly bring themselves back, constantly generate you advantage. So it is definitely a decent strategy, and there are definitely a lot of splashable cards in here. I would find this deck probably somewhere between the A and B tier. If it had Ballardrock, it would be an A tier, no questions asked. It would absolutely be an A tier, but I feel like missing the Ballardrock, it just doesn't have that edge that it needs to be as good as it possibly could be. So I am going to have to put it in B. As much as I personally love zombies, I feel like this structure deck by itself, it's tough. You really could justify being an A purely off of the power of Zombie World. I'm going to be perfectly honest with you. I feel like the power of Zombie World would almost grant it its position here in the A tier, as well as just how innovative the deck can be whenever you start playing it later on in the game. I'm going to leave it an A for now. We might change our minds, but it is definitely a very solid deck. Next up, we have Burning Spirits, the Salamangreat structure deck. This one, without question, I'm just going to tell you now, this is A tier. 100%. This is definitely one of the contenders for the best structure deck, which we're going to talk at the end. We're not putting anything in the S tier until the end of the video, by the way. This is definitely a contender for one of the best structure decks, even for new players. The deck can be a little bit complicated, but I feel like the win condition and the gameplay is streamlined enough to where a new player focusing on it can pick it up relatively quickly. It's not trying to do 10 million different things. It has picked a lane and it is staying in its lane, and there's very little more you want from that, you know what I mean? The deck is doing exactly what it wants to do. You're getting phenomenal value with the fact you've got this Synapse Mining, which is very splashable into any cyberspace strategy. You've got Sunlight Wolf, you've got the Heat Leo, which are all URs that you would need multiple copies of to play this deck, and everything in here. Basically, the deck isn't missing anything, and that's the big thing. It's not missing anything. Anything you could possibly need is in this structure deck, and this is only going to get better with time. Its overall performance in meta at the minute hasn't been great, but it is definitely one of the best structure decks without question. So if you want to get into modern Yu-Gi-Oh, this is not a bad place to start by any stretch of the imagination. Burning Spirits is definitely going to be one of the ones. In fact, the fact that Burning Spirits may be A tier is making me really want to put Zombies in the B tier, so I think I'm going to do just that. Yeah, Burning Spirits in A, Zombies in B. Our next structure deck, Cybernetic Successor, is also going to be one of those decks that anyone who's a fan of the anime GX in particular is going to be a fan of. It includes many iconic monsters such as the Cyber End Dragon, as well as a new, more powerful variant of the card called the Cyber Dark End Dragon. A huge boss monster, 5,000 attack points that is unaffected by your opponent's activated effects. I think that this deck is definitely one of the better ones for newer players, purely from the perspective of the win condition being very clearly defined. You know exactly what you're aiming for when you're playing this deck, and there's nothing really outside of this deck that you need in order to achieve your win condition. Now, there are certainly things you can add to make it better, but there's nothing outside of the deck that you absolutely must play or is so impactful that you would want to break your back trying to get it. It contains within itself a bunch of different control options in the form of Cybernetic Overflow and Invasion, so if you want to play a slower game, you absolutely can. If you want to play absolutely blitzed out turbo Cyber Dragons and Cyber Darks, you absolutely can, with the Fusion Deployment being a really powerful UR card in here, as well as some of the best searching cards in the game in the form of Cyber Emergency, Horizon, Realm, Cannon, Claw, Core. Basically half of your deck just searches for the other half of your deck, so the consistency that the deck operates with, the linear based strategy, I feel like is going to be very friendly for new players. It's going to teach people how to fusion summon, and only how to fusion summon, which is a very solid sort of springboard for learning how to jump into other types. I feel like you only really should be taking on one mechanic at a time so you don't overload yourself. There are of course gaps in the strategy. If your main win condition gets interrupted or stopped and the deck is rather weak to interruption, it does usually result in you being shut down almost completely, which would necessitate, in this budget version of the deck, the playing of some cards that might make the deck go slightly slower. But if you're just learning how to play the deck, learning how to play Master Duel in general, this is definitely not a bad place to start. This is a very, very solid B tier option for sure. It is definitely a good place to start. You might want to branch off relatively quickly off of this deck because it is somewhat linear. You are going to master it relatively quickly, and you're going to use that newfound confidence to jump into another deck type with that sort of background knowledge behind you. Now we have our newest structure deck, Blackwing's Pride. Now, I'm not going to waste anyone's time. This is straight up into the A tier, contending with the other A tier decks for the S tier spot, the God tier structure deck, the best hands down, definitely competing for it. This is the newest structure deck and features an entire archetype of black-winged monsters. Now, Blackwings in and of themselves are exceptionally powerful, even outside of the new cards that they offered, but god damn it, the new cards they brought out in this deck absolutely busted. You've got Sharnga, which is amazing. You've got Vata, which is honestly one of the most impactful cards for an archetype that I've ever seen. You've got Zephyros, which was amazing of them to throw this card into this structure deck. I would have been super disappointed if they didn't. Fantastic for budget players in particular to pick this card up. Sutri, which is phenomenal. They literally give you everything that you need in order to build a good Blackwing deck. In fact, if you were to pick up 3 copies of this deck, a lot of the cards are so good that you'll be struggling what you want to cut out, which is not a problem you have with the other decks. Most of the time when you pick up a structure deck, it's very easy to pick which cards are good and which cards aren't. In this deck, you're legitimately struggling to think, what do I cut to bring this deck down to 40 cards, because so many of the cards are so good. Basically, it relies upon the brand new boss monster, the Blackwing, the Assault Dragon, to inflict a bunch of burn damage to your opponent, bringing their life points down by 700 every time they activate a card, and you're normally able to summon 2 copies of this card on your first turn with excruciating ease. It is honestly ridiculous how little you have to try to summon 2 of these bad boys on your very first turn. Having 3200 attack points, built-in protection while assisted with the Black Feather Whirlwind, as well as the ability to nuke the board whenever you want. This deck is incredible, super straightforward win condition, a little bit complex with the combos at first, but you will very quickly glean the positioning of your cards. It does not take very much time at all to learn this deck. It is rather linear in its playstyle and strategy, but it is also significantly more powerful than the vast majority, if not all, of the other structure decks. And that leaves us with the Galaxy Eyes Cypher Dragon structure deck, Rage of Cypher. Now, Galaxy Eyes are a personal favorite of mine, so I feel like I would be a little bit biased, but damn, even I have to say this structure deck kind of sucks. I'm not gonna lie to you. There's a couple of decent cards in it for value ways. You've got the Starliege Cypher, which is decent. That's pretty much it. I guess the Blade Dragon's kind of nice, the Cypher Dragon's kind of nice. They didn't even give us 5 different extra deck monsters, they gave us 4. This deck, I gotta be honest with you, Chief, as much as I love Galaxy Eyes, you're going in the D tier. You really are. Your boss monster pops a card once per turn as an ignition effect. It simply does not have the tools to compete. It doesn't provide you with any valuable cards that you're going to bring to any other structure deck other than a singular UR that you might run in some decks. No, it generates virtually no value for you in the game going forward. It's not an effective strategy. It's not even an effective strategy when you build it up. And in fact, this structure deck employs some of the worst possible parts of the Galaxy Photon Cypher strategy. They only really use the bad cards. So I don't really know where they were going with this structure deck. I don't know if in their heads they had some grand plan with it, but whatever it was, it did not work. This deck sucks. And that brings us to our almost completed tier list. So what deck in here is our God tier deck? What is our S tier best possible pick for a new player getting in to Master Duel? I've got to be honest, there's only really 2 contenders for this. It is the Salamangreat deck or the Blackwing Assault deck. These are really the only 2 contenders for the role. Dragon Maids and Dark Magician are both great, but they're definitely not S tier strategies. Whereas these 2 are not only extremely powerful in their base state, but they only have room for improvement as you continue to invest or build upon the strategy. I gotta give it the Blackwings. I have to give it the Blackwings. I feel like Salamangreat struggle too much in the meta right now with how a lot of the major decks counter them. So you're going to notice as you climb up the ranks with Salamangreats, you're going to struggle more and more because people are building their decks to counter things that your deck is trying to do. Now, it's still very powerful and you will still net yourself wins, more wins than virtually any other deck on this list, but Blackwings has consistently shown itself being able to compete at the highest levels of play, and you need virtually zero investment, virtually no investment to make this deck really good. There are certain cards you want to pick up, of course. I'm not saying it's perfect in its base state, but the cards you want to pick up are very, very easily affordable. You can branch this deck off in a bunch of different ways in terms of different playstyles or different sort of objectives you want to achieve. So I feel like the versatility and overall power of Blackwings is greater than that of Salamangreats, so I have to give the S tier title to Blackwings. But like I said, this is just all one man's opinion. I've been playing Master Duel for a good little bit, and I'm decently experienced with most, if not all, of the decks on this list. So I know a thing or two, but at the end of the day, this is just one guy's opinion. If you guys have any differing opinions, I absolutely know that people are going to be slandering me for not putting Salamangreats in the top spot, and I get it. Trust me, it's close, but I have to give it the Blackwings. But yeah, if you agree or disagree with any of these rankings, of course, there are room for maneuvering. Some of these B tier decks can maybe go to C. This deck can maybe go to D, stuff like that, but most of the major ranks you want to be paying attention to are definitely this upper echelon of strategies, and I don't think anyone's in a position to argue with this placement. I feel like this is pretty much nail on the head. But yeah, any queries with that, leave a comment down below telling me where you would have placed your decks. If you have any questions about some of the placements, or if you just outright disagree, by all means, the comment section is there for a reason. Subscribe if you haven't, and if you got this far, like the video, and I'll see you next time. Bye bye!